Cool.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Employer Content Show, part of the Talent Insights series brought to you by HireWell and CareerWell. I'm your host, James Hornick. Joining me is my co-host from Job Portraits, employer brand phenom, Nate Guggia. Running out of adjectives.
That's good.
Yeah. All right. Today's segment, demystifying the employer value proposition, or we'll call it EVP for the rest of this conversation. This is one that I think we've been kind of wanting to do for a while, since you really introduced me to the wider world of EVP almost a year ago when I had that troll post that went sideways on me, if you remember that.
I do. Yeah.
So, but okay, first off, so I guess getting into it, what is an EVP?
There's a lot of, there's a lot of definitions out there. I think the way that we think of an EVP is it's key messaging that you share with candidates to help them understand who you are, what you do, and what they'll get and also give in working with you. And I think the most important aspect of doing this kind of work is it helps you know what to say to candidates to help you both make the best possible decision about working together. Mm-hmm. That's what it really comes down to. It's like I see it's a communication tool. We can talk about ways to like get to that point, but it shouldn't be about words on a career site or think that it's anything that is going to attract candidates. Because like when it comes down to it, I don't know, there's probably only 10 words that most companies use to describe themselves in one way or another. So I think like a differentiator, it's not really a differentiator in my opinion. I think it's just more of a really clear communication tool that can align people internally and externally.
Okay.
All right.
Let me get everyone caught up to speed on my take here, and this is why I thought it was kind of a silly topic and ridiculous thing. This is going to piss off a lot of the employer brand traditionalists, undoubtedly, but I'm saying this as an outsider, just someone who is, I've been in this industry for 15 years, right? I had heard the term loosely over the years, but not really locked in. It wasn't until like a year ago when you and I talking where I really kind of understood what it was and why it's seen as so extremely important. And I'm saying extremely important from a monetary value standpoint, the amount of money that gets thrown around on these things. So outsider takes, to me, it's like 100 words of fluffy text. Like anybody out there, Google employer value proposition and examples, and you'll read them and it looks like some copy that someone wrote pretty quickly, right? I know that's not what's happening. There's tons of research that goes into it, but still, no one ever reads these things. I can say from a standpoint of a recruiter, the amount of intake calls I've done over the years with companies for jobs, qualifying what they're doing. I see company values come up a ton. Yeah. Key selling points come up a ton. EVPs never once come up. Never had a company say, here's our EVP. So it's just not something that's on top of mind with companies. I don't know which companies that I work with do and don't have one because it's not something they talk about typically. But I guess the last point is it wasn't until, and all this is fine, but it wasn't until like I learned the numbers around some of these things. Companies pay 5 figures, sometimes 6 figures to create an employee value, to create an EVP, which to me is like, why would anyone do this? So I'm not going to say defend your boys, but yeah, that's one of those. It's so that's just me from the outside. Okay. So how is this used? Why is it important? Maybe why is it important before we talk about maybe how it should be done differently?
Okay. I have seen one of the, I think the best use cases for an EVP that I've seen or been a part of is when companies, I'm thinking of this in terms of really high growth startups, venture-backed companies specifically, who grow at these exponential rates. In a matter of 3 years, they could go from maybe a couple hundred to into the thousands of employees, and things are changing drastically internally. And they go through an identity crisis as a company. Everything is very different. Lots and lots of employees. They might have a board. Senior leadership might have turned over. it's kind of like they get to this point where they really stop and look up. I've talked about this before, but they stop and look up and go like, who are we now? We're still a startup, but we're nothing like the 20 or 50 people who started this company, you know? And that's where the initial, you know, like the initial like values and we'll say like whatever version of an EVP they had when they started the company is now very different. And that's when like it's important to hit the pause button and either do this internally or bring in somebody like externally to kind of guide this process, to ask a lot of people the right questions to surface this new identity and to help brand that for this next generation of talent. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Is it fair to say in the traditional sense, not in the sense that I think that you want to kind of lay it up as, that this is the core of what your company, how you want to brand yourselves, and then you create content from there and different ideas from there centered around this kind of core concept?
Yeah, exactly. So that is the strategic aspect that can drive then the content. And actually, when it comes down to it, the execution of an EVP, whether you do it in a formal way or not, whatever point you get to, the execution around that is really the only thing that matters. But what happens too often is that there will be a lot of money paid to do an EVP, or a lot of like, even if you do it internally and don't outsource it to an agency, the amount of time and energy and resources that need to like come together in order to do this over a long period of time, you'll have like let's say a shiny deliverable in the form of like a deck or whatever, and do a presentation, and everyone's like, oh, that's cool, you know, we have some, and then you don't do anything with it. It seriously like sits on a shelf and collects dust. And at the pace that companies are growing, that work becomes irrelevant quickly. Like if we think about it, like sitting on a shelf, the shelf life of something like that is very short. Because things are changing so fast. And that's why, like, if anybody's really thinking about putting in that much work and spending that much money, you have to really think about that. Like, how evergreen is an EVP really going to be? And what kind of resources do you have to actually create stuff that is going to show people what this means? Because that's it. It's like show, don't tell.
Yeah,
like,
that's the thing, is because I've seen, I get, as a internal practitioner of content that's also our employer brand content, because you and I have talked about that before. A lot of what we do here is also, it wasn't designed this way, but it ends up being something that attracts, talent to us. I talk to people who want to, in different industries and whatnot, who kind of want to do what we're doing from the content side, but struggle just because what their makeup is, or they don't have the resources or whatever. And so I question creating this core identity EVP if you don't actually have a distribution plan. You know what I mean? Like, what's the point?
There is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually don't think there is a point. There's probably a lot of arguments against that, but like the way that I think about it is, like, again, going back to this like show, don't tell mindset, that telling me what your EVP is and putting that on a career site, whatever, like I don't know what that means. But if you tell me stories that are examples and describe what those things mean, well, then suddenly,
yeah,
things connect.
I can see that. If you've got a core message, and then like, okay, what stories do we have that exemplify this, that we can kind of tell, that makes sense to me. How much of this is, and I'm curious, like, I know that the reason why the cost is so high is because there's a tremendous amount of research done. There should be a tremendous amount of research done for how much people are paying for these things. Right. How much of it is like from internal versus external? Is it even in a traditional? I'm sure it's different depending on who does it, right? But like, I'm sure you're talking to employees, but then are you talking externally to understand people's perception of your company? Okay.
Well, we are. I don't want to make this about the way that we do it, but
maybe some companies do it like trash and they don't care. You know what I mean? But I don't know.
Yeah. So doing internal interviews, I don't want to say it's easy, but that's like just common. Like that's table stakes. Doing external research on candidates is really where you get to see like what brand perception is. And that's where you can really start making the necessary changes. And that level of feedback is so key it's critical. So I think you need to do large rounds of internal interviews, and you need to do maybe not equal amounts, but you just definitely need to put a heavy emphasis on doing external research. And there's great resources you can use to do that. But yeah.
Okay. So let me, in an awful way, summarize the traditional approach. Tell me where I'm wrong, because I want to be fair to everyone out there. So you're going to hire a company or get someone or whatever. You're going to interview. You've got some sort of interview templates or whatever you're going to use. All your internal employees. You're going to do the same thing with external, hopefully with user groups or something like that. You're going to take all that stuff, mash it together, figure out what keywords work. We'll start writing some copy. Sure, there's something else here that goes into the process, and then spit out your value proposition, which you then use to decide, okay, well, now that let's create content based on this, which is, as you said, is what doesn't always happen, which is the most important part. And that's ultimately how it works.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Fair summary. Yeah.
Now, what's your method? Because that's what we kind of advertise this for, is that you have a different approach, which, spoiler to everyone out there, this makes a lot of sense to me, because it's a lean startup innovation accounting, minimum viable product approach. But go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll preface this with, this can apply to companies who aren't at that identity crisis stage, or let's say a mature, even global organization. That we're going to set those aside. We're going to say, but the vast majority of companies, I think, can get to this point without having to go through the grueling, expensive EVP process. And I think the reason is because if you look at an EVP, they all lead back to autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And if you ask the right questions, you can actually create content that sources your EVP during the creative process. And so it's flipping it on its head and thinking of it as like a reverse EVP. So instead of starting with strategy, you actually start with content, and you allow the content to drive the strategy, and you iterate from there. And so it's asking just a series of questions that are all basically around this idea of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, sourcing the EVP, creating the content, and then that content allows you to test messaging both internally and externally with candidates. It gives you really quick wins. It gets leadership bought in and excited instead of them being a blocker, which, just so you know, historically, leadership can be a blocker to an EVP after it gets to that final stage. Like after you're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have experienced it, and I know many practitioners out there have too, where it will get to that final, let's say, approval stage or close to it, and senior leadership will come in and say, like, no, we don't agree with this. And you're just stuck, and whoever's leading this charge is stuck going, but we put in all this work, and this is what the people say, and that really happens. And so reversing this process and starting with content, in my opinion, is the fastest way to get to what you actually want to get to with an EVP, and allow the content to create the strategy for you. So that's,
I think that's what, when you and I were kind of talking about this before, that's what always struck me. And I think it's because you and I kind of live this every day. Like, what matters most is the whole point of all this is changing the perception of external people to your company. Now, you want it to be true to your brand. So I'm not going to say that, or true to who you are. So I'm not going to say that like the external feedback is more important than the internal feedback. Like, it has to be a good kind of mixture of both. But to me, it just seems like if you're not getting external feedback is free, and it's fast. And by posting content in various channels, whatever you have, it just seems like that's something you should be doing on day one, just to understand what the market's perception is. How you could be completely wrong. That the amount of times, like I'm sure everyone out there has been in internal meetings on whatever topic, and they got feedback from everyone internally. Everyone thought this was a great idea. They ran it by a few friends or people externally. I mean, maybe if you're getting proper focus groups, it might be different, but it's just a different thing when you finally put it live and you find out that maybe the whole thing kind of fell flat. Like, I just think that getting wide scale external feedback on any
Yeah.
kind of initiative that's content driven is like paramount.
Yeah. Like we see starting with content, it's like the agile version of an EVP. I think most importantly though, it's always relevant, it's always up to date, and it's this mindset of documenting instead of just creating something that could potentially become irrelevant very quickly. And I don't know, like the thing that I think about too is like when you're able to create, this option becomes available to you.
Yeah.
But whether you're external or internal, it applies to both. If you don't have the creative ability to tell stories in compelling ways that make people care, then this isn't an option.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just like an agency that turns out EVPs that can't create content, would never be an option. And the same goes for companies, right? That's why I've been pretty opinionated about this idea that it's safer and in a lot of ways easier to sit in strategy mode than to actually create stuff. Mm-hmm. Strategy mode, even if we like pay tons and tons of money, it feels kind of safe because you're not putting anything out there. And this whole idea is like, put it out there, test it, get the feedback, and keep going from there. So
I like to look at it too from the lens of like what's happened this year, because what we're kind of talking about is most applicable to startups who are changing fast.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies change fast this year. A lot of companies probably had to reevaluate who they are, what they're about, what was important to them, even that don't fall in that startup category. And I think that I would even venture to say that like if somebody put together an EVP that was a more stable industry in March, like might look a lot different now, even if it's just a thought. So
yeah. I was going to give a third option if you want me to.
Go for it. Go ahead.
All right. So I went full EVP. I went reverse engineer it, starting with content. There is a middle ground that can apply to a lot of companies who they still need to discover some things. Maybe they have gone through like somewhat of a reinvention or identity crisis since COVID, or whatever. And it's this idea of a nimble EVP, and you take it's a mini research session, right? Maybe, who knows, 1 to 3 hours, let's say, with key company leaders, priority hiring managers, somebody from like D&I, somebody from marketing. If you have a brand and creative department, include them. And then members of the talent acquisition team, right? So like maybe maximum 15 people. Set aside some time to go through a series of focus group questions that I'm happy to share, by the way. And from there, throughout that time together, you surface themes, you start surfacing stories, and you start surfacing characters, people in your company that you want to start profiling and telling stories about. That you can take all of that information in that session and maybe assign it out to a couple of people, and in a relatively like short period of time, turn around, think about it as like an internal communications guide. We think of it like a candidate messaging playbook, where you have your statement of like your employer brand one-liner. It's like, this is who you are as a company. You get clear on like your job descriptions, your about company, your LinkedIn, your Glassdoor, everything is all updated. You have an idea of like what your brand pillars are from this perspective, communication do's and don'ts, and then like employer brand best practices. Those are the core things that most companies, especially most employees, are missing. Mm-hmm. It's easy to talk about like doing these things, but most employees don't know how to do them. And what this is doing is giving them the exact messaging, the copy, everything to like make all of their profiles up to date and look slick, to start them creating their own content. It's just this how-to playbook. And I think that's like this condensed version of an EVP that can be accomplished in a short period of time, with relatively low amount of resources.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like earlier in the conversation, I was saying that like the amount of I've had countless hundreds, maybe thousands of intake calls on jobs. It's never come up once in EVP.
Yeah.
Values
Yeah.
come up, key points. Maybe everyone has their own versions of why their company's great, but like consolidated, concise. It's very rare. I never hear of EVPs, but even like it's very rare that I talk with companies where if I talk with 2 or 3 different people involved in the process, that they're given the exact same things.
Yeah.
As selling points.
So what I just described, I actually have outlined that I'm happy to share with anybody if they want to email me, nate@jobportraits.com. Shoot me an email and I'll give you the framework, and it's a great like do it yourself starter.
That's Nate@jobportraits.com.
That's Nate@jobportraits.com. I will also post this sometime soon. I'll put it together in a doc and like share it as a slide or as a doc post. But yeah, I think that's a good middle ground.
Yeah. Well, the best part was my last question for you was going to be like, me, I'm a DIY guy. So like, is this realistic to take on as a DIY project? And right there, perhaps it is. So,
it is. I just think about doing any of this kind of stuff. The real benefit when it comes to employer branding is that it gets other people understanding, other people in your company understanding what it is that you do and why it's important, which is often the biggest blocker that anyone leading this initiative has. Is it's just an awareness problem.
Yeah,
really. I think like we can all agree that like in one way or another, employer branding is important. Whatever that looks like for you could be different, or we could maybe disagree on those things, but it's important now. But most people like outside of this little bubble, especially in the company, don't know what that actually means. And this is bringing in people from to give their perspective and chime in and be participants in it. It goes a long way. I'm
glad you said that because I can tie that point. Some of the points I make when I'm talking with Jeff on the 10-minute talent rant, and anytime I'm talking with someone who's like, they had a bad candidate experience related things, or why HR technology is terrible, like all these things. It all comes down to HR, TA, EB, like all these groups not having a high enough profile or enough juice at their company to make an impactful change to make things better. At too many companies, they're either overworked, understaffed, don't have the budget to spend on things because no one quite understands how tricky or how important what they do is. Which is why I really like what you're talking about here, because this addresses that core problem, which I think is the core problem for most of the core problems in kind of the HR and TA space.
Yeah.
All right. Any last thoughts?
I don't think so. No.
All right, cool. That's a wrap for the Employer Content Show. If you want to hear more of what Nate and I have to say, you can subscribe to the HireWell channel on YouTube, where we have a playlist of all of our episodes, and the Talent Insights podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon. Nate, thanks again.
All right, buddy.
Everyone else out there, I'll see you soon.